I want to tell you about the moment I stopped trusting the explanation. I was sitting in a research library in Prague, the kind of place where the books smell like another century, and I was flipping through a collection of architectural surveys from the 1800s, standard academic material, the sort of thing you scan without really seeing. And then I stopped. There was a church, a photograph of a church in Kazan, Russia, dated approximately 1860, and I had seen that church before, not a similar church, not a church built in the same tradition. That exact church, the same proportions, the same tower rising at the same angle, the same arcade running along the facade, the same blind niches carved into the stone at the same height, the same cornice detail repeated 3 times, equidistant in a configuration that has no obvious structural necessity. I had seen it in a survey from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, from the 1850s. I stared at those 2 photographs for a long time, and then I started asking questions I haven't been able to stop asking since. The official history of Western architecture is, on its surface, a coherent story. You learn about the Greeks, the Romans, the collapse of Rome, the Dark Ages, the Romanesque period, the Gothic period, the Renaissance, the Baroque, Neoclassicism, each tradition flowing from the last, each building explained by its cultural context, its patron, its architect, its moment in time, tidy, logical, reassuring. But the deeper I looked, the more that tidiness began to feel like a kind of performance, like a story told too smoothly. Because when you actually go and stand in front of these buildings, when you measure them, when you photograph them, when you compare them across continents and centuries, you encounter a problem that the official story doesn't address. The problem is the pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let me take you somewhere specific. Stand in the old city of Tallinn, Estonia, and look at St. Olaf's Church. Built, we are told, in the 13th century, with its soaring spire repeatedly struck by lightning and rebuilt across the centuries, yet somehow always returning to the same silhouette, the same proportional logic, the same vertical ambition, expressed in the same geometric terms. For a period in the 16th century, it was reportedly the tallest building in the world. Hold that image in your mind, that spire, that relationship between the tower and the nave, between the vertical thrust and the horizontal mass. Travel to Krakow, Poland. Look at St. Mary's Basilica. Similar period, similar soaring verticality. Fine, these are neighbouring countries in the broad Baltic and Central European cultural sphere. Shared trade routes, shared craftsmen, shared ecclesiastical networks. The official explanation holds. That's reasonable. Now travel further. Look at the Cathedral of the Transfiguration in Odessa, Ukraine. Look at the Church of the Assumption in Perm, deep in the Ural region of Russia, thousands of kilometers from the Baltic. And then look, really look, at Trinity Church in New York City, built in the 1840s, and the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul in Philadelphia, completed 1864, and the Anglican Christ Church in Montreal, and the Cathedral of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Not similar, not in the same tradition, not inspired by European models, matching, proportions that align, facade ratios that repeat, tower heights relative to nave widths that appear across these buildings to conform to a single underlying geometry, cornice profiles that carry across continents, column spacing that follows rhythms too consistent to be coincidence, too widespread to be explained by a single school of thought. This raises a simple but critical question. How do buildings constructed across thousands of miles, in countries with no documented communication network that could support such coordination, by craftsmen supposedly trained in isolated regional traditions, how do they conform to a shared geometric logic with such unnerving precision? The official explanation, when it comes, is always the same. Neoclassicism. The spread of pattern books, architectural manuals circulated through Europe and the Americas in the 18th and 19th centuries. Palladio, Vignola, Schinkel. But the official explanation begins to collapse here. Because these pattern books, I've read them, many of them. They describe principles, they show examples, they suggest ratios. They do not and cannot account for the specific coincidences we see when we place these buildings side by side. A pattern book can tell you to use a Corinthian column. It cannot explain why a church in Kazan and a church in Philadelphia share the same idiosyncratic cornice profile, the same non-standard tower fenestration, the same blind arcade rhythm that doesn't appear in any of the standard reference manuals I've consulted. Something else is at work. I want to be careful here. I want to be precise, because what I'm describing isn't a feeling or an impression. It's a measurable phenomenon. Let me take you to specific cases. In the city of Samara, on the Volga River in Russia, there stands a cathedral, the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception of the Holy Virgin Mary, a Roman Catholic structure completed in 1906. Its twin towers rise 47 meters. The proportional relationship between the tower width at base, the tower height, the pitch of the Gothic spire, and the width of the central doorway portal follows a precise geometric formula. When you run the numbers, and I did, sitting in a rented apartment with a stack of architectural surveys and a calculator, the formula yields a specific ratio. Call it what you like, I'll call it the signature. Now look at St. Joseph's Cathedral in Bardstown, Kentucky. Built 1819, far smaller, yes, but the same signature. The same proportional logic governing the relationship between elements, not approximately, not roughly, to within a margin of error smaller than natural material variation would account for. Now look at the Cathedral of Santiago in Chile, the Church of San Francisco in Lima, Peru, the old cathedral in Montevideo, Uruguay. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. And here's the strangest part. When you ask architectural historians about this, the conversation has a way of getting vague. You get discussions of shared influence and the universality of classical principles. You get references to Jesuit missionaries carrying European designs to South America. You get, in other words, a kind of comfortable hand-waving that doesn't actually engage with the specific numbers. I kept pushing. The silence was deafening. If these buildings were all designed by trained architects working from a shared tradition, a reasonable hypothesis, then we should be able to trace the lineage. We should be able to follow the thread from master to apprentice, from atelier to atelier, from Europe to the Americas and back. That's how architectural history normally works. The names survive, the correspondence survives, the plans survive. Except when they don't. The documentation for an unsettling number of these structures is either missing, vague to the point of uselessness, or contradictory. Church records in provincial Russian cities that burned at suspiciously convenient moments, building permits in American frontier towns that no longer exist, or that reference architects who cannot be found in any professional registry of the period. Foundation stones with inscriptions that don't match the dates on official placards. Cornerstone ceremonies recorded in local newspapers that conflict with the dates of supposed construction by margins of decades. Not months, decades. I found a church in a mid-sized city in the American Midwest. I'll be vague here deliberately, because I've been asked to be, where the official founding date is listed as 1847. But a photographic survey from 1842 shows the building already standing, already in use, already sufficiently weathered to suggest it had been there for some time. The photograph exists. The building exists. The 1847 date is in the official record. How do you build a church 5 years before you break ground? The evidence suggests something much larger than a clerical error. In the old city of Lviv in western Ukraine, a city that has passed through Polish, Austro-Hungarian, Soviet and Ukrainian hands, each leaving its administrative mark, there is a cluster of Baroque churches so precisely oriented that an astronomer I corresponded with described their alignment as not accidental. The Dominican Church, the Bernardine Church, the Cathedral of the Assumption, each oriented on an east-west axis, yes, that's standard Christian practice, the altar facing Jerusalem, the congregation facing the rising sun, but the specific declination of each structure, the precise degree off true east, corresponds to the angle of sunrise at a specific calendar date. Not Christmas, not Easter, a date in late autumn that has significance in systems of knowledge much older than Christianity. Was this intentional? Was it inherited from an earlier structure? Was the city itself laid out on a pre-existing grid that nobody thought to question? Nobody seems to have asked. I did. The deeper I went into the municipal archives of Lviv, cross-referencing Habsburg surveys with Polish church records with Soviet-era archaeological reports, the more I found evidence of structures built on top of earlier structures in ways that the conventional historical timeline struggles to accommodate. Foundations that predate their supposed construction by centuries. Stone courses laid in techniques associated with periods far earlier than the official record acknowledges. This raises a simple but critical question. What was there before? Let me state the problem plainly because it deserves to be stated plainly. Between roughly 1750 and 1900, an extraordinary number of large, sophisticated stone buildings were constructed across the entire surface of the inhabited earth. Cathedrals, city halls, universities, train stations, courthouses, libraries. The sheer volume of this construction is, when you actually tabulate it, staggering. Hundreds of thousands of major public buildings, millions of tons of dressed stone. In cities across Europe, North America, South America, Australia, and parts of Asia that were under Western colonial administration. We are told this was accomplished by a rapidly industrializing civilization that had, as recently as a century prior, been building largely in wood and brick, without iron, without steel, without reinforced concrete. A civilization that was still using horse-drawn transport for most of its construction logistics. A civilization that, in many of the locations where these buildings appear, had been present for only a few decades. I want you to hold that claim and then walk through some of the structures it must explain. The United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C., a structure of such geometric sophistication that modern engineers who have surveyed it have expressed quiet amazement at the precision of its dome geometry. The state capitol buildings of individual American states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Ohio, Illinois, all built within roughly the same half-century window, all displaying a level of constructional refinement that should, by the official account, have been nearly impossible given the logistical realities of frontier-era America. But that's the United States. You might argue, and people do argue, that American wealth and the ambitions of a new nation could account for it. What about Australia? The city of Melbourne was, by official account, a small settlement of tents and wooden shacks in 1840. By 1870 it had a general post office, a public library, a state parliament and a royal exhibition building that would go on to host the first parliament of the Australian nation. A building of such scale and architectural refinement that it has been compared favourably to the great public buildings of Vienna and Paris. 20 years, from tents to Vienna. And when you look at the Royal Exhibition Building, completed 1880, and place it alongside the Palais du Trocadéro in Paris, completed 1878, and the Natural History Museum in London, completed 1881, you find yourself looking at 3 buildings on 3 separate continents that share not just a general aesthetic, but specific structural decisions. The same height-to-width ratios in their central halls, the same approach to fenestration, the same decorative program repeated in the spandrels. 3 different countries, 3 different architects, officially. 3 different building programs with no documented coordination, and the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. This is what I mean by the worldwide coordination problem. Not that someone planned it, I won't go that far, but that the current explanation independent parallel development, the spread of pattern books, the universality of neoclassical principles, does not actually account for the specificity of what we observe, the official explanation collapses under the weight of the coincidences. Something was coordinating this, or something was already there, waiting to be inherited. I want to be careful with this word. Tartaria. If you search it online, you'll find two things: a broad historical term used by European cartographers to describe the vast territories of Central and Northern Asia, and a rapidly growing body of alternative research, suggesting that this cartographic label may point to something far more significant. Not a country in the modern sense, not an empire with a capital and a flag. Something stranger than that, something more like a civilization, a network, a tradition, a body of knowledge that has been systematically removed from the record. I'm not here to tell you Tartaria was a secret empire. I don't know that, nobody knows that, that's the point. But I am here to ask what would happen if we took seriously the possibility that, sometime before the period we call the modern era, there existed a civilization of considerable sophistication, a civilization with advanced knowledge of geometry, of materials, of astronomical alignment, of architectural engineering, that left its mark on the built environment of the entire Northern Hemisphere, and possibly beyond. Because if that were true, many things become easier to explain. The identical churches? Perhaps not designed independently by unconnected architects. Perhaps designed or inherited from a common template. A common system, a body of architectural knowledge transmitted not through the pattern books of the 18th century, but through something older, something that was already embedded in the landscape when European settlers arrived in Philadelphia and Melbourne and Buenos Aires. What if those settlers didn't build those cities? What if they found them? I know how that sounds. I'm aware of how that sounds. But let me ask you to sit with the question, rather than immediately dismissing it. Look at the foundations of some of these 19th century buildings. Look at the stone courses at basement level, where the original construction is most exposed. In a significant number of cases I have personally documented through site visits and photographic analysis, you find a discontinuity. A change in stone type, a change in laying technique, a change in the grade of dressing on the stone face. Below a certain level, the stonework is different, older looking, different in texture and colour and precision, as if the 19th century builders constructed upward from a foundation they didn't themselves lay. Not everywhere. Not in every building, but in enough buildings, in enough cities, across enough continents to constitute a pattern rather than an anomaly. The deeper I went, the more this pattern appeared. And here's where the Tartaria hypothesis becomes impossible to ignore. Because the territories conventionally labelled as Tartaria on 17th and 18th century European maps, the vast spaces between the Urals and the Pacific, between the Arctic and Central Asia, are precisely the territories where some of the most anomalous architectural evidence exists. Russian cities that appear in early surveys with fully formed stone infrastructure that supposedly materialized within a generation. Siberian towns with public buildings whose scale and sophistication wildly outstrips what a frontier settlement could have produced. Architectural features in the provincial cities of the Volga region, Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, Yaroslavl, that echo, with uncanny precision, features found in cities on the other side of the planet. What knowledge moved through those territories? What tradition of building was carried by whatever civilization occupied that immense space before the cartographers labelled it simply Great Tartary and moved on? We don't know. The official record says there was nothing there but nomadic peoples and empty steppe, but the buildings suggest otherwise. And this is where the mystery deepens in a direction I find genuinely disturbing. Because if there was something there, some prior tradition, some older body of knowledge, what happened to it? Not why, not when, not under which administration or through which historical process. No. How do you erase an entire civilization's physical presence from the historical record while leaving its building standing? How do you strip the documentation while preserving the stone? Let me suggest a few mechanisms, not definitively, as possibilities. Fires. An extraordinary number of municipal archives from the critical period, roughly 1780 to 1870, were destroyed by fire. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is the famous American example, but it is far from alone. City halls burned in dozens of American cities during this period. Courthouses, land registry offices, the precise institutions whose records would have documented what existed before European settlement and what was built, by whom, and when. Coincidence? Perhaps. Cities in the 19th century were fire-prone environments, wooden structures, open flames, no fire departments worth the name. But the pattern of what burned is interesting. It's almost never the churches. It's almost never the large public buildings. It's the records offices, the land surveys, the foundational documents, not the stone, the paper. Then there is the matter of reclassification. In the academic study of architectural history, there is a practice, entirely legitimate on its surface, of assigning buildings to periods and traditions based on stylistic analysis rather than documentary evidence. When documentation is missing, you date by style. You say, this building has these features, therefore it belongs to this period. But what if the dating is circular? What if we assign these buildings to the 19th century? Because they appear in 19th century photographs, and we assume they were built in the 19th century, because they appear to belong to the 19th century. What if some of them were there already, and the photographs simply documented their existence rather than their creation? I'm not asserting this. I'm asking, how would we know? The silence was deafening. And then there are the small, strange moments that accumulate. The church in a provincial Russian city whose foundation stones were dated during a 1960s renovation to a period 3 centuries before the church's official construction date. The date noted in a Soviet archaeological report, then never mentioned again in subsequent literature. The old maps, Por, Bleu, Ortelius, Mercator, that show cities in locations where official history places only empty wilderness. The architectural manuals from the early 1800s that reference building techniques as if describing existing practice rather than proposing innovation. The phrase that appears in multiple early American municipal documents, always vaguely, upon the existing foundation. Upon the existing foundation. Whose foundation? From when? The evidence suggests something much larger than what the official record is willing to accommodate. I want to talk about the decorative programs, because the architecture isn't just structural, it speaks in a visual language, and that language is stranger than the structural coincidences alone. Walk into the old Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, Ireland. Look at the carved stone details in the Romanesque nave, the chevrons, the rope mouldings, the stylized leaf forms. Now walk into the Cathedral of St. Sophia in Novgorod, Russia. Different country, different century by the official accounts, different cultural tradition. And yet there are the same chevrons, the same rope mouldings, the same leaf forms organized in the same hierarchical relationships along the same architectural elements. Now travel to the Basilica de la Sagrada Familia in Quito, Ecuador. Not Gaudi's famous one in Barcelona, the older Franciscan church in Quito, parts of which date by official account to the mid-1500s, making it among the oldest stone churches in the Americas. Look at the portal decoration, the solar emblems above the central doorway, the geometric patterning in the tympanum, and then look at the Church of the Epiphany in Yaroslavl, and at St. Nicholas Cathedral in Mogilev, and at the Cathedral of the Assumption in Astrakhan. The same solar emblems, the same geometric patterning, not in the same style, the local inflections differ, but the underlying symbolic vocabulary is shared. A sun with a specific number of rays, a geometric border with a specific repeat unit, an arrangement of cross-forms that appears too specific to be coincidental. What system of symbols was this? Whose alphabet? The official explanation for cross-cultural symbol sharing is always diffusion. Ideas travel along trade routes, carried by merchants and missionaries and diplomats. But diffusion leaves traces. It leaves transition forms, hybrid examples, the evidence of ideas in transit. What we find instead, in case after case, is not diffusion, but simultaneous presence. The symbol appearing fully formed in Estonia and in Peru and in Siberia without the intermediate steps that a diffusion model would predict. As if it was already everywhere, as if whoever built these buildings shared not just a structural language but a spiritual one, a cosmological one, a way of marking sacred space that transcended the boundaries of what we're told were entirely separate civilizations. And that's where the Tartaria hypothesis becomes impossible to ignore in another sense. Because if there was a civilization that once occupied a vast territory stretching from Eastern Europe across Central Asia, a territory through which ideas and people and knowledge could move unimpeded, then you have a mechanism for this shared symbolic vocabulary that doesn't require diffusion. That requires only that whoever moved through that space carried the tradition with them to every corner of the world they reached. And the world they reached, it seems, was most of it. Every pattern has an endpoint, and this pattern has one too. Sometime around the last quarter of the 19th century, roughly 1870 to 1890, though the edges are fuzzy, the great building program stops. Not slows, stops. The extraordinary proliferation of large, sophisticated stone public buildings, the torrent of construction that had reshaped cities on every continent within the space of a single human lifetime, simply ceases. What follows is different. The buildings are smaller, or they're built in iron and steel and concrete, or they're built in a new aesthetic, the eclecticism and then modernism of the late 19th and early 20th century, that makes a deliberate point of breaking with what came before. The architectural historians have explanations for this shift. Economic factors, new materials, changing tastes, the rise of modernist philosophy, all reasonable, all partially true, no doubt. But there's something else in the record, something that sits at the edges of the official account, acknowledged but not examined. The period 1870 to 1890 is also the period of maximum institutional consolidation, the period when Western governments in city after city established formal systems of building records, land registries, historical documentation. The period when the story of the built environment was, for the first time, systematically written down, fixed, made official. And what was fixed and made official was, in most cases, the story that what existed had been built recently by known architects for documented patrons on previously empty land. That story had to be created in order to be official. Before it was created, something else was the de facto understanding, something less tidy, something that left room for the questions I've been asking. The silence was deafening. And here's the strangest part. When you read local histories from the early 19th century, memoirs, travel accounts, newspaper reports from settlers and colonists and administrators encountering these cities for the first time, you find a curious absence of the language of construction. These accounts describe arrival, settlement, governance, commerce. They describe buildings that exist, but they very rarely describe buildings being built. The great stone structures appear in the record more often as pre-existing features of the landscape than as active construction projects. There are exceptions. There are absolutely records of specific construction projects. I'm not suggesting there were no buildings built in the 19th century. I'm suggesting that the proportion of major stone public buildings that appear in the record as newly constructed versus already present is more skewed than we've been taught to expect. And that skew, when you sit with it, when you let it accumulate across city after city and continent after continent, begins to feel like evidence. Evidence of what? I don't know. That's the honest answer. But the pattern is there. Let me try to say something true about what I think we might be looking at. Not a conspiracy, not a secret cabal of architects manipulating history, not a political program. Something more profound and more melancholy than any of that. The loss of knowledge. It happens. We know it happens. The Library of Alexandria is the famous example, though scholars debate how much was actually lost. The knowledge of Roman concrete, a material so sophisticated that modern engineers spent decades trying to reverse engineer it, was genuinely lost after the fall of Rome, and genuinely recovered only in the 20th century through analysis of surviving structures. The astronomical knowledge of the Maya, the navigational knowledge of the Polynesian peoples, the metallurgical knowledge of the Damascene sword makers. There are multiple documented cases of sophisticated bodies of technical knowledge that were lost completely, leaving behind only artifacts that demonstrate capabilities we struggle to reconstruct. What if something like that happened on a much larger scale? What if there was a tradition, call it what you like. Tartaria serves as well as anything, a tradition of architectural knowledge that was sophisticated, widely distributed, and systematically applied across a vast territory. A knowledge of geometry, of material science, of astronomical alignment, of structural engineering that allowed the construction of buildings whose qualities we now attribute to 19th century industrial civilization. And what if that tradition was interrupted? Not erased by conspiracy, but lost through the ordinary catastrophes of history, plague, conquest, the simple entropy of civilizational collapse, and what we call the 19th century building boom is actually the story of a new civilization, encountering the remnants of the old one, inheriting its buildings and writing itself into those buildings' history. Because that would explain everything. The identical churches? They were already there, or built from surviving templates that the new civilization inherited without fully understanding. The missing documentation? There was no documentation to create because the buildings pre-existed the record-keeping systems, the worldwide coordination. There was no coordination needed because the buildings were the artifacts of a civilization that had already, long before, achieved worldwide reach. The official explanation collapses here. Not because there's a better definitive answer, but because the official explanation requires us to believe that an extraordinary amount of coordinated, sophisticated construction happened in an extraordinarily short time across an extraordinarily wide geography, leaving behind an extraordinarily incomplete paper trail, and that none of this is worth examining more carefully. I don't find that credible. Not anymore. I go back sometimes to that photograph. The church in Kazan and the church in Philadelphia sitting side by side on a library table in Prague. And I think about everything that photograph implies. If those two buildings share a common origin, not a common influence, a common origin, then someone somewhere once knew how to build in a way that crossed every boundary we now consider fundamental. Language, culture, ocean, time. And they stopped, or they were stopped, or something happened that we have not been told about, that we may not be capable of being told about through the official channels, because the official channels were built on top of whatever it was, literally built on top of it, stone by stone, record by record, history by history. I think about the foundations that go deeper than they should, the documents that burned, the architects whose names don't appear in any registry, the symbols that appear simultaneously on buildings separated by half a world, the dates that contradict each other, the buildings that predate themselves. I think about the millions of tons of stone that were placed with a precision we can measure and cannot fully explain, by hands we cannot identify. For reasons we have not been told, this raises a simple but critical question. Maybe the simplest and most critical question I know how to ask: who built these buildings? Not officially, not according to the plaque on the wall or the date in the city register or the name of the architect supposedly responsible. Who actually cut that stone? Who understood the geometry well enough to repeat it identically across 10,000 miles of ocean and steppe and mountain? Who knew that the sun on a specific morning in late autumn would clear the roofline at precisely that angle? Who chose these proportions, and why are they the same proportions, and why does nobody in the official record seem to think that's strange? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. There is a pattern in the stone. It runs through cathedrals in Russia and churches in Peru and public buildings in Australia and chapels in the American frontier and temples in Eastern Europe. It is precise, it is consistent, it is world-spanning, and it is, officially, not there. The deeper I went, the more clearly I could see it. And the more clearly I could see it, the less satisfied I became with the silence that surrounds it. A silence that has lasted, in some cases, for centuries. A silence that has been maintained through the loss of documents and the burning of records and the comfortable vagueness of scholarly hand-waving and the simple human preference for a tidy story over a troubling one. I don't have a tidy story to offer you. What I have is the pattern. What I have is the stone. What I have is the growing, unshakable conviction that somewhere behind the official history of the built world there is another history. Older, stranger, more beautiful, and more sad. A civilization that built in a language the whole world spoke, and then fell silent, and left its sentences standing in every city on earth, waiting for someone to read them. I'm still reading.